Prime Minister Andrew Holness asserted that, quote, "The misadventure of the PNP, which diverted us from a path of economic growth, selling the people of Jamaica false hope and unrealistic dreams, wasted the gains of post-independence Jamaica of the JLP administration, which it succeeded." Prime Minister Holness said, "We had a flirtation with ideologies that were foreign to us and did not serve us well. With all the social problems that needed to be addressed, had we stayed the economic course and ensured that the economy was aligned to the opportunities that were created by the industrial transformations that were taking place, Jamaica would be in a better place today." It was these controversial statements that incited outrage from the opposition PNP and Marley supporters. It is no secret that the burgeoning crime problem in Jamaica has proven to be a Herculean task. Crime has plagued us for more than 5 decades, and in this video, I will attempt to establish the origins of crime and violence, its architects, and the effects they have on the people of Jamaica. At this point, it is undeniable that Jamaica has a crime problem. In order to understand how we got here in the first place, we have to go back in time to learn about the history of crime and violence in Jamaica. While political party rivalry in Jamaica can be traced back to pre-independence times, modern-day Jamaican politics have been overshadowed by Kingston's influential garrison communities. In order to establish and maintain political dominance in key constituencies, the loyalty of impoverished but highly influential gangsters in Kingston ghettos was secured by the main political parties through the development of large-scale, highly politicized, and heavily armed public housing schemes, essentially operating as state within a state. The roots of Jamaica's current crime epidemic is not just the stories of drugs, gangs, and guns, but has deeper connections to the CIA, the Cold War, and the efforts to marginalize the 1970s Democratic Socialist government of Michael Marley and his People's National Party. Marley's convincing electoral victory in 1972 deeply troubled the United States, as his open commitment to democratic socialism, implementing moderate progressive policies like the minimum wage and free education, and his close friendship with Fidel Castro placed Jamaica firmly in the crosshairs for American covert operations. Let us take a trip back in time. The roots of the current relationship between politicians and the urban poor in Jamaica is generally agreed to have been nurtured under Alexander Bustamante. The people of Jamaica had struggled against exploitation and slave-like conditions. These working people had cut the sugarcane, planted the bananas, picked the pimento, and grew the foodstuff that fed the society. Colonialism exploited their labor and denigrated them as human beings. These people rebelled to get better working conditions. The 1938 rebellion was the high point of these workers' protests. Out of these protests, Alexander Bustamante formed a political vehicle called the Jamaica Labour Party, or JLP. Working class people from the grassroots embraced the JLP and were very loyal to Bustamante, to the extent that some workers shouted, and I quote, "I will follow Bustamante until I die." End quote. Despite the commitment to Bustamante, there had been a vibrant opposition called the People's National Party. And the quality of the political leadership in Jamaica was world-class, with high levels of tolerance for opposing ideas. Gradually, in the wake of the international Cold War dictates and intense competition for power, the JLP deserted the working people. Alexander Bustamante, in his role as Minister of Commerce, the unofficial government leader at the time, was able to determine the levels and allocations of public works and in the process control the distribution of work and employment opportunities. Due to the legacies of colonialism and underdevelopment, there was a lot of people who did not have a steady job, and this provided the necessary conditions for the emergence of patron-client relationships. So, we can see where the architect of all this foolishness from cronyism, nepotism, and violence is none other than Alexander Bustamante. Aside from the granting of political favors, historically, the rival political parties established their own industrial trade unions. The JLP had the Bustamante Industrial Trade Union, BITU, and the PNP at the Trade Union Congress, TUC, which emerged out of the Caribbean labor crisis of 1938. By the mid-1940s, the BITU and TUC had their separate spheres of influence, but rival union members were routinely used as instruments to violently disrupt the political organizing of the opposition. However, the full departure from the demands of the working people came when the JLP came under the control of Edward Seaga. The debasement of the working people was on two fronts. The first was the establishment of sweatshop conditions to erode the gains of the workers after 1938. Seaga boasted of his ability to attract foreign capital to exploit non-union labor. This foreign capital was integrated into narco banking. The second debasement was the escalation of gun violence and the division of inner-city neighborhoods according to political allegiance, with party supporters choosing to live together in certain sections and the rival party supporters violently forced out of others. This was the antecedent by 20 years of violent, politically controlled housing divisions that were labeled garrisons. During this time, it was not unusual to find that the distribution of tickets for seasonal farm work in the US was always divided along party lines. So once again, we can see that the architect of this crime and violence is the Jamaica Labour Party. After Jamaica gained independence in 1962, the economic landscape did not change for the better, and the hopes which accompanied self-rule turned sour. As a result, a growing lawless counterculture began to emerge in the slums of West Kingston in response to escalating rates of poverty and hardships. Individuals calling themselves quote-unquote rude boys proclaimed their rejection of common social norms and practices. And by 1963, the rude boys, desirous of improving their fortunes, had begun to fight each other for control of the ghetto, contributing to the development of what would come to be known in Jamaica as turf politics, where political parties sought geographical or positional control over given areas using gangs as part of an electoral strategy for securing votes. The infighting between the JLP-aligned gangs like the Phoenix and the PNP-aligned Spanglers and Viking gangs eventually incited a low-intensity war in West Kingston. The thuggery and violence of this period of Jamaican history eroded the basic values of decency in the society. Being a bad man was now the ambition of many youths. Hustling of the poor came with this new political culture. Once in power, the JLP sought to further manipulate the newly influential gangs for its party interests. A key component of its plan resulted in the construction of a standard oil refinery in the capital's waterfront district known as Kingston Pen. The development had displaced many families previously reliant on fishing for their livelihood. These families became increasingly agitated about being forced to become squatters, and they received a great deal of public support due to the hardships they faced. The JLP capitalized on this situation announcing the construction of a public housing complex which would absorb the families and stand out as a symbol for the new socially progressive Jamaica. In order to obtain land for the new housing development, the state had to bulldoze a slum area called Bakawal, which was populated by the supporters of the PNP. The shanty town was primarily an entry point into Kingston for rural migrants seeking a better life in the city. It was home to approximately 1,500 people and was regarded as one of the most dangerous and crime-filled areas in Kingston. The local business elite welcomed the clearing of the area. In the past, a number of high-profile altercations between market vendors and the Bakawal residents had turned violent. The shanty town would be transformed to become Tivoli Garden. In time, this move came to be seen as the first step towards institutionalizing the garrison community political model and the violence which accompanied it. With the construction of Tivoli Gardens beginning in 1965, the JLP formed a political base from which it would exercise power in the community and eventually throughout much of Kingston. The project was managed by a Harvard-educated anthropologist called, guess who? Edward Seaga. Seaga later became the Prime Minister of Jamaica, and he was very familiar with and well known in the Kingston community during the 3 years of his academic fieldwork. Witnessing the success of the GLP model at Tivoli Gardens, the rival PNP created and supervised similar garrisons in Trenchtown and Arnett Gardens. And the PNP capitalized on the JLP's displacement and harassment of ghetto dwellers, organizing opposition and establishing a counterforce within the slums. This pattern of forcing the poor and vulnerable to choose political sides eventually resulted in up to 20 garrisons being established across Kingston. Over months, indeed years, and in the run-up to the 1967 election, the splintering of urban communities into garrisons alongside continuing high rates of unemployment resulted in increased everyday violence in the streets. Waves of strike by BITU and TUC added to the protests of the residents displaced by the Tivoli Gardens construction, which in turn brought about retaliation and disruption by the gangs, and the lines between the criminal and the political became increasingly blurred. Gangs on both sides of the political divide were increasingly bold. In the summer of 1966, police were routinely shot at, and one assault on them involved an attack with a bomb packed with dynamite. Fights with fists, rocks, and bottles became a thing of the past. In September 1966, Jamaica experienced its worst episode of electoral violence to date, when in the course of just 2 weeks, a dance hall was firebombed, a theater bombed, and public buses attacked, in addition to countless armed firefights on the streets. The violence got so out of hand that the JLP announced a state of emergency in Kingston, which lasted for an entire month. This first seismic episode of the new type of organized electoral violence marked Jamaican politics for the next 45 years. More than 500 people were injured, 20 people died, and 500 were arrested during police raids in the newly formed garrison communities. By the early 1970s, Jamaica's post-colonial economic order was rapidly losing credibility in the eyes of the Jamaican people. On the doorstep of the US and with the JLP holding political power since independence, Jamaica had come to be thought of as a safe and ideologically aligned US ally. All this changed with the election of Michael Manley and his People's National Party administration in 1972. Manley's election turned Jamaica into one of the primary battlegrounds for progressive change in the developing world. Manley declared that his government sought the third part, a non-capitalist path of development to distinguish experiment like ours from the neo-colonial capitalist model of the Puerto Rican type and the Marxist-Leninist model of the Cuban type. Famously, he was on record as saying, "I am a friend of Castro, but I am a democratic socialist and he's an affirmed communist. I am certain that he views me as a fuzzy liberal, and although the country struggles economically during his first two terms from 1972 to 1980, his government introduced a raft of progressively social policies, including public housing programs, rent control, price controls on basic commodities, a minimum wage, literacy programs, maternity leave for women, healthcare, and youth employment programs." But Manley's political mantra, "better must come," was undermined by international economic events beyond his control. The first shock came in the form of the 1973 OPEC Oil Crisis. With Jamaica totally dependent on imported oil, sharp price increase quickly sent the economy into a downward spiral, resulting in a rising trade imbalance. And then came the PNP's announcement in the late 1974 of a commitment to democratic socialism, backed up by the imposition of an increased bauxite levy and the formation of the International Bauxite Association (IBA), which generated a new wave of fear unsettling US investors and Washington. In retaliation for the bauxite levy, Kaiser Aluminum moved its operation to Australia, a pattern of relocation which was followed by other foreign and domestic investors. Manley was engaged in a battle which he could not win. In 1976, he was reduced to negotiating support from the International Monetary Fund, IMF. By 1978, Jamaica had agreed to a very strict structural adjustment program which demanded price liberalization, interest rate adjustments, currency devaluation, and cuts to social spending. So it was that Edward Seaga emerged as a reactionary right-wing figure to steer Jamaica on a more US-friendly course. Seaga had influential connections in the United States and had once served as Jamaica's governor to the IMF, in addition to holding a similar position with the Inter-American Development Bank, the World Bank, and the Caribbean Development Bank. Seaga was also a member of the Latin American Advisory Board of the Presidents of ADELS, an operation owned by 200 of the largest firms in North America, Europe, and Asia. And to assist him in intimidating the political opposition, at the same time solidifying his own electoral support, Seaga turned to his trusted enforcer of the Phoenix Gang, predecessor of the Shower Posse, the Don Claude Massop, and his second-in-command, Carl Bayer Mitchell. While the arming of the gangs in this new era did not follow the otherwise strict ideological division, the JLP did receive covert shipments of arms from the CIA, in addition to other social control tactical equipment. The ex-CIA agent Philip Agee later revealed that the CIA was using the JLP as its instrument in the campaign against the Michael Manley government. I'd say most of the violence was coming from the JLP, and behind them was the CIA in terms of getting weapons in and getting money in, Agee said. Agee further claimed that the CIA and the international aluminum companies were working with certain JLP supporters in an attempt to unseat the Manley government. Agee, who had carried out similar operations in Ecuador in the 1960s, spoke across the country of CIA methods. These, he said, included the spreading of false information in the local and foreign press, funding opposition groupings, supplying arms and logistical support, and helping plan disruptions and paramilitary operations. Consequently, the growing violence on the streets of Kingston even touched reggae music's global star Bob Marley. Hoping to bring an end to the violence, in April of 1978, Marley, at his One Love peace concert symbolically raised the hands of Marley and Siaga on his stage to signal a political truce. Marley had been persuaded to become involved by the Don Clyde Massop, and an old friend of Marley's from his days in West Kingston. Massop, although a JLP affiliate, had been growing tired of the gunfights, jail time and deaths which benefited nobody except the politician. He famously proclaimed, "The peace will have to last because our lives depend on it. The youths have been fighting among themselves for too long, and only them get dead. Everybody I grow up with is dead," Massop said. Remarkably, Massop, a JLP man, had begun to make alliances with PNP gang leaders like Dennis Copper Barth, but recognizing that peace between the gangs of the marginalized sufferers would threaten the established political status quo, the police, at the behest of the politicians, did their best to ensure that it would not last. In May 1978, Barth was the first of the Dons to be killed in an effort to restart Kingston's gang war. The hit on Barth was organized by Lester Jim Brown Coke, the father of Christopher Dudus Coke. Coke, the elder, was regarded as having his eye on the leadership of the JLP's most powerful gang, and his ambition proved useful in destroying the truce organized by Massop. In February 1979, the police executed Massop during a traffic stop in which they shot him over 50 times. And by the end of 1979, all of the gang leaders who had organized the truce had been killed. Other Dons and their top-ranking gunmen went into exile in the United States, Canada, and England with the assistance of the political elite, many emigrating with fake travel documents. This exodus of criminal figures from Jamaica in the mid-1970s set the foundation for the new international crime networks that were to emerge. So it was that economic crisis, destabilization efforts, and high levels of political violence effectively overshadowed Marley's campaign to bring about democratic socialism in Jamaica. The PNP would not gain a third consecutive term, and as Marley himself remarked, Jamaica's experiment in democratic socialism came to an end amidst a hail of bullets and a river of blood. In the 9 months leading up to the election of 1980, an estimated 800 people were killed as a result of political motivated violence, making it the bloodiest election in the history of Jamaica. Between 1976 and 1982, 1,096 tenement yards, which housed 17,000 people, were destroyed by arson with a 2 square kilometer area around the PNP garrisons of Rima and Ardent Gardens. Additionally, during this time, an estimated 2% of the 15 to 27 age group were killed each year. This period is regarded as a major turning point for violent crime in Jamaica. After this, high levels of murder and violence became a notable and lasting feature of the society. In the election, the JLP gained 51 of the 60 seats in the House of Representatives and almost 59% of the total vote, and Siaga became one of President Reagan's staunchest allies in the region, cutting ties with Cuba and supporting the invasion of Grenada in 1983. But his attempt to make Jamaica more investment friendly were not enough to turn the economy around. It should be noted that Jamaica's assisted shift to the right in this period was part of an accelerated counter-revolutionary push in the Caribbean region, which saw the CIA supporting the Contras in Nicaragua, the Death Squad in El Salvador, and consecutive military forces throughout the Caribbean. In this period, too, the activist intellectual Walter Rodney was assassinated in Guyana, and Archbishop Romero was assassinated in San Salvador. The reversal of foreign investment under the PNP government, in combination with the conditionalities imposed by structural adjustment policies, decimated much of Jamaica's economy. Following the standard IMF formula, tariffs were reduced, the Jamaican dollar devalued, tax cut, state-owned enterprises privatized, and public services and government employment levels slashed. The austerity measures brought about reduced industrial subsidies and supports, in addition to the implementation of increased user fees for health and educational services. The result was a steady increase in the cost of living for the poor and a steady rise in unemployment in Jamaica. Jamaica was told that a prosperous future was to be obtained by the pursuit of comparative advantage within the global market. Its productive economy was to be transformed into a service economy largely based upon tourism. In Washington, it was thought that Jamaica's embrace of the free market would endorse Ronald Reagan's belief that free enterprise Jamaica and not Marxist Cuba should be the model for Central America in the struggle to overcome poverty and move towards democracy. As a result, the enriched dons replaced the state as the major patrons of inner city residents and even replicated the state services providing housing, job opportunities, welfare, and even informal systems of justice. With the invasion of the cocaine economy in the 1980s, the localized political gangs of the 1970s morphed into transnational criminal enterprises with a tight hold over local politicians. The wealth that was made from the cocaine business far outweighed any of the handouts that had been doled out by politicians in the years before. The tables were turned, and the power relations between the politicians and the dons were changed. The growing political influence of garrisons afforded the housing projects greater levels of autonomy and diminished state interference. The process in which garrisons were created was not unlike the creation of mini-feudal states within West Kingston. The most famous of the criminal organizations to emerge in the new climate of neoliberalism within the garrison was the Shower Posse, now led by Lester Jim Brown Coke. Coke had made a name for himself as one of the most trusted, effective, and brutal hitmen of the JLP, and as such stepped into the vacuum of power created by the killing of Claude Mossop in 1979. Evidence of this ruthlessness was seen during Coke's brutal involvement in the massacre of 12 people in Wilton Gardens in 1984. He quickly established that he was not a person to be messed with Garrison's control over Port Bustamante and now a network of exiled dons across the United States and Canada. Coke was seeking to take his posse to the international level. The drug trade within Jamaica was also shifting to meet the demand of the global market. To complicate matters, the connections between the CIA and the gangs became even apparent after a 1989 expose in the Miami Sun-Sentinel. Speaking on condition of anonymity, a former Jamaican government official stated that, quote, things became so hot for the gunmen that they began to leave for the States, most of them with Siaga's blessing. Many left Jamaica through their CIA contacts, end quote. The CIA's assistance to the gangs, which included more than just facilitating travel, also consisted of arms training. The anonymous official also stated, quote, these guys are not just criminals, they are trained terrorists. I am speaking out because the US does not want to take the responsibility for the monster it helped to create. End quote. With the expansion of the Sour Posse and other gangs overseas, their violence was no longer restricted to Kingston. While Lester Coke ran the Jamaican side of the operations, his counterpart, Vivian Blake, ran things stateside. And from Miami, Blake and Coke, who presented themselves as construction contractors, were known campaign financiers of Siaga's leadership bids. According to one report, the US law enforcement agency, the ATF, linked 700 drug-related murders in the United States to the newly arrived Jamaican posses from July 1987 to July 1988. Then, in November 1988, Coke killed the driver of a minibus. It was thought that he would walk away without being charged, but the Minimus drivers organized a strike in protest and Coke was taken into custody. However, he was soon released on bail and was never convicted as the star prosecution witness in the case failed to testify. The political protection afforded to the JLP-aligned gangs did not last long, and the re-election of the reformed Marley in 1989 signaled that neoliberalism had triumphed over the need to construct a more equitable society. That same year, former Surapasi member Charles Littlenut Miller was charged with drug trafficking but agreed to testify against other gang leaders in order to receive immunity. In his testimony, he implicated himself in 9 murders and revealed his connection to the JLP as a political enforcer as well as his CIA connections, going so far as to say that, quote, "the United States made me what I am," end quote. Upon his re-election, Marley once again negotiated an assistance plan from the IMF. However, this was a mistake because the IMF is one of the biggest instruments of demobilization that the CIA used to wreak havoc on the Jamaican economy. The IMF was not impartial and was never concerned with the interests of the Jamaican people. When Marley finally decided to break off with the IMF in 1980, this decision resulted in increased antagonism from the US, and the US heightened its efforts to destabilize the Marley government because for the first time, a third world country took a step to show the world that it can live without the IMF. And there you have it, the history of crime and violence in Jamaica and its architect. I hope that you found this to be an interesting watch. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.